Okay, welcome to our next session here. I hope everyone can hear me okay. We are here with our next guest speaker for Roger That. I want to introduce to you Jonathan Ward, who is a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society and a NASA Solar System ambassador and a resident astronomer for Viking Ocean Cruises. Hopefully, you might have some time to have him talk a little bit about his experiences with these cruises, which are fascinating. He has written for widely acclaimed books about the U.S. space program, including Bringing Columbia Home, The Untold Story of Lost Space Shuttle and Her Crew, and of course, the biography about Eileen Collins, who will be our featured speaker this evening, Through the Glass Ceiling to the Stars. So without further delay, I'd like you to introduce to everyone Jonathan Ward.
Oh, thanks so much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And let me share my screen and bring this up for you. And I'm going to give you the opportunity to hear a little bit about what it's like working with someone who's an iconic astronaut in her own right, and then an iconic woman astronaut. And I think this is it's a fascinating opportunity to share this in the celebration of women in space exploration. And wanted to give you a little bit of a peek behind the scenes about what it's like to work on a book project with somebody who is such a cultural hero and a hero of our space program as it was with working with Eileen. So without further ado, I'm just going to move through here, and I've asked Glenn to moderate questions. If anything comes up, I'm going to make sure we leave plenty of time at the end of the conversation to answer questions. But if something is not clear along the way, we'll make sure to stop and address those issues as they come up. Okay, so first of all, I'll tell you a little bit about my background. I did work in the space program briefly back in the 1980s. I worked with Boeing on the Space Station Freedom program as a contracts manager. I've got a background in psychology and in systems management, actually, not in space science. But the bulk of my professional career has been working in leadership development and organizational change. And I still work as an executive coach. I have been working with the Center for Creative Leadership. So I'm used to working with leaders in lots of different types of disciplines. And in my sidelight, I'm a collector of space artifacts and also an amateur astronomer. And as Glenn mentioned, I've written 3 previous books on American spaceflight history before working with Eileen on her autobiography. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the genesis of the book, how Eileen and I got started together. And this is a picture from Space Fest in 2016. Eileen was the author of the epilogue on Bringing Columbia Home because she was the commander of the return to flight mission after the Columbia disaster. Mike Leinbach, my co-author, felt, and I felt that it was a good way to end that book by having her tell the story about the return to flight. We had Bob Crippen, who was Columbia's first pilot, lead off the book, but Eileen was the writer of the epilogue. So we got to know each other starting in June 2016, working on that, and really enjoyed the brief time we had working together on writing her epilogue for the book, and then realizing as I got to know her better that she didn't have her own story out there. I'd seen descriptions of her story in other places, but she had never written her own memoir. And so when Bringing Columbia Home came out in January of 2018, I ran into her at the Space Mirror at Kennedy Space Center as part of the NASA Day of Remembrance. And I put the bug in her ear about writing her memoirs, and if whether I was the one to do that to help her out or if somebody else was, I just thought it was important for her to get her story told. And so in the times that I encountered her between January 2018 and the present time, I continued to encourage her to think about that, and she kept thinking, well, I just really don't have the time to do that. So what happened finally is when we got to 2020, we had exchanged a few emails along the way, just as we normally do, just in terms of keeping in touch with each other. But in late April of 2020, she said, of course, this is right after COVID had broken out and everything shut down. And she said, suddenly I have the gift of time. And if you're still interested in working on this project, let's talk about it. And of course, I was very interested in having that conversation with her. And so we had our first talk on the Cinco de Mayo in 2020. And one of my first questions to her was, are you sure that you really want a male author to work with you on this project? Because I was very concerned about how this might be perceived with a man working with a woman to tell a woman astronaut's story. And in the course of having that conversation, I found out, first of all, that I was not Eileen's first choice as a co-author. She'd actually talked to several other people who felt that maybe was not in their line of expertise. So I was, it's always a nice grounding experience to find out that you're not necessarily somebody's top pick, but that they're going to be happy to work with you anyway. So we did get a chance to get that out in the open. And, to her, the fact that I was a man was really not a big issue. It was more about the style, my knowledge of the spaceflight program, my personality, the trust that we had built up in telling the Columbia story. And to her, that was much more important as a collaborator than my gender was. But again, I was really concerned about how other people would view my participation. I really did not want my involvement in this to in any way cut back on the impact of her story. And so I was very conscious of the fact that I was here to help her out, to help tell her story, but I did not want my own involvement to get in the way of that or dilute the message in any way whatsoever. So after we had that initial conversation, we wrote up basically what I would advise any set of people who are collaborating on a project together to do, is to write up a letter of agreement. We talked about the vision and tone that we were going to have, the purpose for the book, the audience that she was looking for, what our roles and responsibilities would be, the schedule, and how we would be accountable to each other along the way. I think it's really important to get those kind of things out in the open up front, just because I think it helps you make sure that you're both approaching a long-term commitment. Like writing a book is really a long-term commitment, and to make sure that you're both coming into this with your eyes wide open as you understand not only the big picture, but also how you're going to work together on a day-to-day basis. And so we had a pretty clear discussion on this, and it was helpful for me, having written 3 previous books, to know what the process was going to look like and to help manage your expectations along the way in that. So, thinking about Eileen's goals for the book, as we had our first conversations there, that her primary goals was that she wanted to inspire the next generation to study STEM types of disciplines or STEAM disciplines, really to be thinking about technical disciplines as an opportunity for people in all walks of life. She really wanted to make sure that people understood the importance of being able to study in those domains. She wanted to provide a factual historical account. She realized that she was an astronaut, an iconic astronaut in a key moment in the history of the space program. But she also has said that the space shuttle program is still not really well documented. There's a lot about what went on behind the scenes that has never really been told. And so it was important for her both to document from a historical standpoint the space shuttle program and some key moments in NASA military history. And so to make this a readable book, because she wanted to target this audience towards young adults, is that she wanted to make sure we were balancing both the technical and the history and her own story in here, because they all are intertwined together. We wanted to make sure that this was going to be readable by people in the, say, 8th to 9th grade level. And so that's kind of how we targeted the tone of the book as we were writing it. And we tried to make it as conversational as possible, at least in the way, to make it authentic in her voice as well. So, going to the tone about how this was going to be, if you know Eileen, it's all about being positive and finding ways to work through things. So this was going to be a positive story. And even though she had a very rough childhood, this was not going to be a misery memoir. She was going to talk a little bit about the challenges she faced as a child, but this was going to be very much more about how you work through that and how you take advantage of opportunities that come along for you. We talked about the current environment as well, and she said, this was not going to be a Me Too book because she never really saw herself as being a victim along the way. Certainly she saw challenges that she was facing in working through what had been very much a male-dominated environment. But this was going to be a story about how you work through that system, not how you fight the system. Some things we were going to steer clear of, things like politics and religion, even though Eileen is a deeply spiritual person, and she does mention the importance of religion to her, that that was not going to be an area of focus in the book. So this was going to be, again, sticking more to the facts of what was going on. Again, just in terms of her own style, of course, it's all about being positive and working together. So there was not going to be gossiping. We were not going to be throwing people under the bus. There's a high level of confidentiality and trust among the astronauts, and we were not going to do anything to violate that. This was not going to be an academic book, even though Eileen has been a college professor, and I've certainly worked with academics before. This was going to be much more of a personal story than a description of things from an academic or a historical standpoint. In terms of just the facts, this was going to be more about her experience in that environment. We agreed that the narrative would end when she retired from NASA. We really did not get into the last 15 years of her life, but for her, the important part of the story was up to the point that she retired as an astronaut. And again, we were going to stick with her personal experience and not use this as an opportunity to tell other people's stories, except as they might relate to what she was going through. So, as we talked about roles and responsibilities, we contracted on this that Eileen would be available for interviews. She would. My expectation as we went into this was that I was going to be doing the bulk of the writing, that maybe I would just be doing the interviews with her and then doing the writing for her to approve. But as we worked together, she found that what would happen is we would do an interview and then she would want to go back and think about it some more, and then she would come back a week later having written 7, 8, 10 pages of single-spaced reflections on what we'd been talking about, which was then just fantastic material to use for further discussion. So she was very much an active co-author in this process. I had a lot of material for us to discuss. She has a lot of material on hand, obviously, as having been through all of these missions, going all the way back to her ROTC days. She still has her flight log, which has been very helpful for going back and checking dates and people who were involved in certain key events. She identified for me the people that she would like me to have interviewed as part of telling her story. Of course, approved drafts, and then she was primarily the one who was going to be involved in getting the word out to people, because she had so many contacts through all the different organizations that she belongs to, and publications that she's written for before and things like that. My role basically as the co-author is kind of the blocking and tackling of the process here. I was driving the process, having been through it before. I knew what the rhythm and flow was going to be like. I was going to deal with the business end of writing the book. I'd find us a literary agent, I'd get us a publisher, et cetera. I'd do as much research as possible ahead of time in terms of pulling interviews together or going back through the historical record, finding documents, websites, the NASA archives of different missions and things like that. But I wanted to make sure that I was just using that as a basis for asking questions to draw the story out of her, because you can recite the facts one way, but then again, you start talking about what were you thinking as you were doing this rendezvous pitch maneuver on the return to flight mission, or what did it actually feel like for you when you were approaching Mir for the first time and things like that. So it would be on one hand, you'd have that dry narrative, but then you wanted to really kind of pull out more about what the experience was like. And of course, one of the things that I make sure I ask myself whenever I'm working on a nonfiction project is I'm always challenging the narrative. I'll start writing out a fact, or I'll start writing a sentence, and I'll go back and look at it and say, wait a minute, how do I know that? What's the fact that backs this up? And even with Eileen, when she would tell a story, sometimes I'd go back and just verify, are we sure that this happened at this time frame, or that this person was involved? And so, what would happen is after an interview, she'd go back and double check something and find out exactly when that had happened. And so again, from the mechanic standpoint as well, that I maintained the drafts in the final version of the book. So that's kind of how we just divided up the roles and responsibilities. But again, my primary thought in this whole process is that I'm here to help facilitate telling Eileen's story. I'm not here to embellish that in any way. I'm not going to push her in direction she doesn't want to go. This is her story about her life and her experiences. And I want to make sure, number one, that we're serving that primarily. And, I also wanted to make sure that I was not abusing the privilege that she was extending to me to have this kind of access to her. Maintaining confidentiality was really important. And that I think comes from some of my background as an executive coach, is that, I want people to feel comfortable when they're talking with me, that I will only be sharing the information that they have agreed to be shared in other places. And so while Eileen was generally very, very open about the things that we could talk about, there was very little that actually didn't end up making it into the book. But I just wanted to make sure that I maintained that confidentiality and also didn't abuse my privilege of access to her throughout this whole process. It was interesting talking about our personality types as we got into this, of course, with her being a woman pilot and commander, me coming from the corporate world. Not only did we have those different types of career backgrounds, but it turned out that our personality types, for those of you who know the Myers-Briggs, we have completely opposite personality types. She's an extrovert, sensor, which means somebody who's focused on the facts and the details at hand, thinker, and judger. So basically somebody who is in the moment, working with the facts, making quick decisions. And I'm somebody who's more an introvert, thinking about the bigger picture, thinking about experiences and feelings, and then keeping things a little bit more open-ended. And so it actually worked out very, very well to have people of opposite types working together, because we both played off of each other's strengths and areas that might be blind spots for us. So it was a really good partnership from that standpoint. And I think we were both very flexible in there. It was fun, as two of us who had grown up essentially at the exact same time in the history of the space program. She's 55 days younger than I am. And I couldn't help but think sometimes when she was talking about some of her experiences about what I was going through at exactly that same age and at that same time in my life. And it was really interesting to think about how our careers and our life trajectory really started diverging earlier in our adulthood. And the other commonality is that both she and I have a systems background. She has a master's degree in operations research and in space systems management, and I have one in systems management through the University of Denver. So we both kind of approached looking at the world through this kind of systems mindset, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more detail. Just real quickly, some of the key milestones. We had that first conversation on May 5th. We were hoping to, we weren't sure what the time frame was going to be like, but when we finally got a contract with the publisher at the beginning of December, the publisher said, can you have a draft to me by March? And we realized that was pretty much impossible, because at that point we weren't even halfway through writing the manuscript. We hadn't even gotten to her NASA career by the beginning of December. But we did agree on a date of May 15th, which the publisher then asked us to move up to May 1st. So we were working really, really hard during the spring, and got that delivered to the publisher. And so it was less than a year from the time that we first had our very first conversation to the time that we delivered this actual manuscript to the publisher. This was more than twice as fast as it took to as it took for me to write Bringing Columbia Home. It took me about 2.5 years to write that book, and we had 12 months on this one. And it was released on October 19th. So it's been out for just about 4 months at this point now, but it was a very accelerated time frame. And I'm very happy that I didn't have any other big projects going on, because it would have been almost impossible to meet this. After we got the deadline from the publisher, I was writing in the neighborhood of 1,500 to 2,000 words a day to try to keep on schedule. So some of the logistical challenges we faced here, again, we're doing this all during COVID. So traveling is pretty well shut down. We couldn't get together in person. Eileen was still on 4 boards. So she was on a number of corporate boards and not-for-profit boards, in addition to being on the National Space Council. So getting her attention at times could be very difficult. It might be several weeks between when we were able to have conversations or when she'd even be able to get back to me with emails. So I had to make sure that I wasn't wasting time or twiddling my thumbs, that I had plenty to work on in between times so we could have our conversations together. One of the things that we really were sad about was that we couldn't have access to the archives at Johnson or Kennedy, because those 2 centers were both shut down due to COVID. Luckily, I was able to find a lot of the archive materials at the National Archives website and pull some of that material down from that. But we did 50 or more interviews, totaling about 71 hours over the course of 11 months. It was all done by phone. And again, as I mentioned, very aggressive schedule. But it is possible to write a book in completely virtually, but it's not necessarily the ideal way of doing it. At the same time we were going through this, the literary agent that was working with us was dying from an inoperable brain tumor, which was just a horrible tragedy, because he's such a brilliant guy, has so many great ideas, but you know, he was really not available to us because he was going through this this horrible process, and you know, we just felt awful for him. But he did live through to see us deliver the manuscript of the book, and was very happy with that. It was one of the last manuscripts that he saw before he passed away. The other challenge that we had was I thought we would have people falling all over themselves for the story, but it was funny. We got a number of rejections from publishers who were saying that you know, gee, you know, this is great, but why didn't she write this book 15 years ago? And of course, 15 years ago, it wouldn't have been time for her to write this. She wasn't prepared to write the book 15 years ago, and so just the whole publishing environment is very, very strange. And for anybody who's thinking about writing a book, I would really encourage you to be thinking about what it's going to be like to try to have to market that, or to get somebody to sell your book for you. So this is what our collaboration ended up looking like. It was all done either by phone or by FaceTime, conversations with her in her living room and me out in my work shed. And it was a fun experience. We both really enjoyed our times having the calls together. The hardest chapter to write among the book, which I thought was interesting, was her chapter about her youth growing up in Elmira, because again, as she was saying, she didn't want this to be a misery memoir, but her childhood was obviously something that was a key formative period in her life. And she wanted to make sure that she told a story that was fair to her parents, who both had their shortcomings as human beings, but at the same time were extremely influential to her, and both the best parents they could be, but they had their human flaws. And so trying to get that tone exactly right for her, that she felt comfortable with that, and that she also wanted to make sure that her siblings felt comfortable with, was probably one of the toughest parts of this, of writing the book. And again, it was not something that I could really do too much about, other than to help her through the process of telling the story and making sure we were focusing on things that would move it forward and not get too bogged down. I obviously had a lot to learn. I knew about her space career, but I knew nothing about her Air Force career, other than that she'd been to test pilot school. And so it was interesting to go back through the first half of her career, you know, the time before she got to NASA, and really to hear more about all of the things that she did during the course of her Air Force career, and even as she was training to become an astronaut. So part of the job of being a co-author is to know the facts where you can, but then to be open to be able to use that as a starting point for questions rather than for dictating that this is how the way things had to go. So I had to leave myself open as much as possible to ask questions about things, and obviously to learn as much about this as any reader of the book would learn, because this was all new information to me as well. A quick aside, the original title of the book as we proposed it was Faster, Farther, and Higher, Blazing a Trail to the Stars. And over the summer of 2020, Wally Funk's book came out, Higher, Faster, Longer. And of course, Eileen wrote the foreword to that book, and we realized that the titles were way too similar. And so that was that our publisher came up with several concepts for book titles, but eventually came up with the one that Through the Glass Ceiling to the Stars, the story of the first American woman to command a space mission. So it was not the initial title that we wanted to have, but again, for people who are thinking about becoming authors, your publisher is going to be the one that helps suggest the title. It's the one you come up with may be cute, but the publisher might have a better idea about where you're going to be going with that. Wanted to talk a little bit about the systems perspective as we were telling the story. For those of you who've not studied systems theory, I just wanted to let you know what we're looking at here is you're looking at yourself in the context of a bigger thing that's going on. And so, in Eileen's situation, she's looking at herself in the system of the military, for example, coming into the Air Force as one of the very first women pilots who's going through training and eventually becoming a test pilot and things like that. So it's becoming aware of not only who you are and what's going on around you, but where are the formal and informal types of structures that might be influencing things? What are the mental models that people are holding about what people who are part of the system look like? What are the patterns and trends that are forming out? What are the worldviews that people have during the course of this process? And we never really explicitly talked about this mindset, but I think it was driving a lot of when we were writing the book. This was a lot of what was in our minds was, what's the transformation that's going on here? What are we, what is she turning the system into as we go from an all male military to now a mixed gender military? What are the views, the worldviews that people have at various stages in this system? You think about going back to her commanders who would ask questions like, well, it's always been the wife of the top student who is the one who's going to run the wives club. Is your husband going to run the wives club? Things like that. So, being able to try to understand where people are coming from in different ways really kind of drove our analysis and our telling of the story. A question came up last week. I was having a conversation with a book club that was reading the book, and someone asked the question, was there in fact a glass ceiling? And they said, when you go through and read the book, you don't get the feeling that Eileen had to break through this, but she was just pushing through it very, very gradually and tenaciously. And so, I think as we talked about this in one of the chapters, is that this really is a case study in leading cultural change from the middle. Eileen was not in charge of anything other than her crews, or the people who were directly reporting to her. She could not shape the policies and procedures at NASA, but what she could do is lead that cultural change from the middle and embody what it was like to be somebody who was a leader in the new way of looking at the world. And so, if you couldn't make orders about things, you could at least be somebody who was going to be able to affect change. If you push too hard, sometimes what can happen in again, from a biological system, a system is trying to keep equilibrium. And if you push too hard, what happens, like in a cell, if you're too much of an irritant, you get encapsulated and rejected. And so at some point, you've got to figure out how do you make things happen without making yourself too much of a pain. So, we were looking at things like implicit rules and explicit rules and expectations, what's rewarded, what isn't rewarded. These are the kinds of things that she was really looking at. And again, it was like, how does the system deal with outliers? You can be an outlier, but at the same time, you've got to make yourself seem valuable to the system there. So what are the behaviors and attitudes that you're demonstrating as either somebody who's an actor within the system or as a stakeholder in the system? Again, so I think in terms of there being like a shattering kind of thing, maybe that wasn't quite happening quite so much as there was her demonstrating the types of behaviors that were going to help anybody be successful, whether it was a woman or a man. She set a role expectation that I think is equally valid for anybody who's trying to be successful as an astronaut or as a military pilot or as a test pilot. One of the things that was interesting for us as we were going through and getting the book reviewed is that we're telling the story about things that were happening in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and we're going back and looking at that through the lenses that we were employing at the time. But as we had a copy editor who was reviewing the draft, it was interesting because she was a younger copy editor, and she said, I think you have the one example. She said, you have this one story, which I think you intend to have this one message, but people today are going to read this entirely differently. And so it kind of challenged us to get out of our mindsets and think about how the younger generation is going to respond to some of these stories. And societal mores are just moving so rapidly right now. It's really an interesting minefield to kind of be walking through right now, is how do you tell the truth and at the same time not say something that's going to be so challenging to the current mindset that it's going to have people shut you down. And I think that's part of the problem in the environment today, is that if people start reading things they don't agree with, if you don't tell it in a way that's done properly, that people are going to just completely shut it out. So we had to make sure that we were telling a story in a way that was going to be heard by today's audience. And even thinking about the concept of astronaut itself has changed from what it was back when she was going through astronaut training and flying on the space shuttle. The astronauts today have a much different type of role than they did back in the old days. There's this other question that came up too, is like during this book club conversation, is the job of astronaut itself even inherently sexist? Because we get into this discussion, if you recall, from her talking about preparing for her first mission when that got delayed, was that she was waiting to start a family, and for female astronauts, you can't fly or train while you're pregnant. And so obviously it's very, very different experience for a woman going through being an astronaut than it is for a man starting a family, because the male is not restricted by physical restrictions. So there was even these kind of questions coming about, is the job itself inherently sexist, or are there ways that we can make this more equitable? This might be something to explore at some point in the future. One of the other challenges in working with an astronaut, and I've heard this whenever I've heard other people talk about, for example, with the Apollo astronauts or other people, there's always the question that comes up: what did you feel? What did it feel like to be walking on the moon? And it's interesting working with somebody who's been trained in the military or in any kind of environment where you've got to be able to act quickly and train yourself into these kinds of dealing with very complex situations, that you end up with the person who's in a command role versus somebody who's in going through the experiences that you might have as a human being. As the commander, you really have to kind of take charge and get right into making things happen. You really can't stop and think about, am I afraid, or whatever it is. Eileen makes this great distinction in one of the chapters of the book. She talks about her first meeting with President Clinton when they're announcing her as going to be the commander of the first woman commander of a space shuttle mission. And she talked about being scared about going into the room full of reporters for the announcement. But then she said Eileen was scared, but the commander could handle the situation. And so what you find is that, you know, you have to be able to the challenge for me, I guess, maybe was one of those kinds of things when you ask the astronauts what we were feeling when you were walking on the moon, and they'll say, like, I wasn't feeling anything, I was doing my job. And you know, the challenge here is to not want to put words into somebody's mouth. So, you know, if there was not an emotion that was going on, you know, I would certainly ask a lot of questions to try to draw these things out. And, you know, we have tools like this kind of thing, which are very helpful for using in having conversations with coaching clients, for example, about exactly what it was that you were feeling. And Eileen was very good about going through and, you know, when I would ask her what it felt like, she would come back with some very carefully chosen words that very clearly described what was going on for her in her mental state at the time. And so I made sure that, you know, when she came back with a word that described an emotion, that we would talk about that, but I was not going to try to push her off of that word for another synonym that might be different than, or might be something that people would expect to see in other places. So again, not wanting to put these kind of emotional words in her mouth, but being aware that people want to see more of that kind of thing in books. And I'm curious, and I'm seeing this in some of my conversations with other readers, you know, are there gender differences in how readers react to the narrative? And it's hard to make generalizations here, other than the last group that I talked to, the men who were involved in the group said they felt that there was plenty of emotional description there. Some of the women were saying they wish they had seen more of it, but then I've also seen the opposite kind of things happen. So I think it's as much the personality of the reader as it is the gender as to whether they're expecting to see these kind of emotions in the book. But again, part of the role was to try to draw that out as much as possible. You know, and I think Eileen was really wonderful about being able to share about things that were going on with her and her family. This was a great picture of her after she came back from her first mission, excuse me, her second mission with her daughter. And you know, this became the spaceflight awareness poster for safety awareness for going back for the return to flight mission. But I think she was one of the first astronauts I've seen who've actually talked about what the families are going through, because I think, you know, the fear and the concern, for example, watching a launch and trying not to think about Challenger, but of course everybody's thinking about Challenger, and she was one of the first to acknowledge that what a horrible strain that does put on families when they watch that kind of launch happen. And so I think she was very emotionally aware and very emotionally connected with what was going on for folks, and I was very grateful for her to share that and put that in the book. You know, on the question about being first, you know, this is one of these kind of things that, you know, somebody could have really made a big point out of being the first one to do it. But in talking to Jim Weatherby, who was her first commander, this is a direct quote from him. I got the sense she didn't really care that she was the first woman pilot to fly at NASA. She just wanted to fly. She just wanted to do it well. And it was all about the mission. And that's, it's very much what everybody else that I've talked to her about her has said. And, you know, I think that Eileen recognized that as well, that the fact that she was first was as much a coincidence of timing as anything else. You know, if she had come along a year earlier, she might not have had these experiences or opportunities. Had she come along a year later, somebody else would have been the first one to do it. All she really cared about was doing the job excellently. And she was aware very much about the kind of legacy that she was creating here, that she knew that as the first, there was this pressure on her to do it perfectly and to be as well prepared as she possibly could. She said, I did not want to hear the woman broke the rules and screwed up. So she was doubled down on her desire to try to do things as perfectly as possible. And again, be a role model for anybody, whether they were male or female, in terms of excellence of operation and in performance. So, going back, despite the changes in environments and things like that, the core lessons that came through this book for me as I was helping her write this, in addition to what I learned about Eileen, was that culture change is always harder than you think it's going to be. Even if you make a directive that we're going to include women from now on as pilots and things like that, you've still, the directive is one thing, but you've still got to make that happen one person at a time. And so Eileen showed us that the best way to do this was to happen one conversation at a time. If there were issues, if there was a problem she had with somebody, you go and talk to that person directly. Escalating it to the up the chain of command should be the last resort. If you haven't had that chance to have that conversation with somebody, then you've deprived them of the opportunity to learn from you before being disciplined about something. So, that's one of the things that frequently happened. I know when I was a boss, if somebody came to me and complained about one of their coworkers, I would just say, well, what did they say when you talked to them about it? And, if the response was, well, I haven't talked to them about it first, then I would always say, you need to go back and have that conversation, and then we can have that, we can talk about that later on. So, again, I think for her, one of the things that comes through, she may not have said it in these words, but again, you've got to prove yourself to be a valuable contributor. You've got to be prepared. You've got to be dependable. You've got to tell the truth. You've got to be open to exploring new ways of doing things other than what you thought, and admitting mistakes and learning from them. These are all parts of being, I think, just a good human being, but also a good, both a team member and a good leader in an organization. That these will see you through anything that you're involved in, whether you're a corporate citizen or somebody who's working with a volunteer organization or somebody who's flying in space. That you want to be, for me, I guess the reason that Eileen was chosen to do some of the things that she did was that she was the low risk alternative. People knew that she was going to be prepared. People knew that that she was going to give everything that she did 110% or more, and that she was going to be completely open to not hiding anything about what was going on, and she'd be the first one to share any learnings that she had as she went through the process. So that's, to me, was kind of the genesis of the writing of the story of the book, and hopefully, we tried not to hammer these lessons home too hard. We didn't want to hit people over the head with them too much, but I thought it was effective the way that we put them at the end of the book there to try to sum them up. We hope that they were salted throughout through the rest of the narrative, but I think I really like that Eileen wanted to summarize those as a separate afterthought to the rest of the narrative of the book. Just wanted to share a few stories from the cutting room floor very briefly. We were limited by the number of pages. We had a word count that we had to go through, and we had to go back and cut the book down by about 10 to 15% to meet the word count from the publisher. But just a few things here. This was from the Hog Log. This was the notebook that the astronauts in her group 13 kept. There's a picture of Eileen during her survival training with the group in September or August of the year that she became an astronaut. We'll go through these pretty fast. This is another one. This is a few pictures from the third launch attempt for STS-93 after they'd had two previous scrubs. This is coming down the elevator in the crew building, and instead of her walking out the door, what she did here was hold a picture of the crew out the door to try to ward off any jinxes, and then looking out to see if everything was clear, there were no gremlins out there waiting for them, and then finding out and walking out and seeing the training team who she had invited to come and visit from Texas. This is the training team all holding masks in front of their faces so that they would not jinx the mission. One other story that which I thought was great, I'll share very briefly, was one where she had been invited to go talk to at the dedication of the National Women's Military Memorial at Arlington Cemetery. She was supposed to introduce Al Gore there, and on her way flying there in her T-38, there was a big ice storm over the Washington area, and T-38s can't fly through through ice. So she had to divert to Huntsville to refuel and try to get to Washington the next morning. And when she was at Huntsville, got out of her T-38, went to the airport, and walking into the hotel at the airport in her flight suit, she walked into the middle of a Star Trek convention and immediately found herself surrounded by Klingons and people who were wondering what she was supposed to be. And she told them she was a pilot, and people thought, oh, okay, well, nice costume. And of course, they didn't realize who it was that they were actually talking to. But she did in fact make it to Washington the next day to introduce Al Gore at the National Women in Military Service Memorial Dedication. So one other thing I wanted to share very briefly was this is the two of us. When the books finally came out, we got together in Nacogdoches, Texas, to sign some copies for ourselves and for our friends. And we asked the young woman who was the clerk at the hotel to take our picture while we were while we were signing the books. And she came over and took the picture. And you could tell she was very, very curious about what was going on. And we were holding up the book for her to take a look at and say, this is the woman here. This is the astronaut. And she wasn't like, oh wow, you're an astronaut, or oh wow, you're a pilot, or whatever it is. She just kept looking at the two of us, and finally she said, you all wrote a book? You wrote a whole book? And it was again one of those things that mores have changed somewhat. The thought that to her that it seemed impossible that people could actually sit down and write a book was kind of a humorous sidelight for the two of us. I just wanted to conclude to say that I'm extremely grateful to Eileen that she asked me to work with her on this project, and that she still sees me as a partner to her. She invites me to events. She could very easily have just said, thanks, we're done. Thanks for the book, we'll see you later. But she continues to invite me to events, and she definitely thinks we are not done telling this story. So she and I are going to be joined at the hip for the foreseeable future, which is just such a great honor and such a great pleasure. She is, without a doubt, as Jim Weatherby said, the nicest person that he's ever met. And she is certainly up there for me as that as well. She's just an absolutely phenomenal person. And I hope you really enjoy having the opportunity to hear her speak tonight, because she's just such a great human being. I can't say enough wonderful things about her. And again, what a thrill and an honor it was to help tell that story. So with that behind me, what I'm going to do is stop and open it up to questions.
Okay. We invite questions from folks on chat. If you want to take some time to think about and post some, we'll certainly entertain those. But to kick off, I've got a couple here. I'm curious about the aggressive schedule you mentioned for publishing the book. Was that directly tied into the health conditions of your literary agent? Is that the driving factor, or was it something else?
No, I think it was the publisher wanted to make it the lead-off book for their fall catalog, and so the fall catalog started off in October, and so he said if we're gonna get this published in October, we have to have the draft done by March or April. And I think what helped, originally he would have pushed for March, but since he'd seen that I'd done a good job, it was the same publisher that we had actually with Bringing Columbia Home, and he knew that book was in good shape, so he gave us a couple extra months to work on it. But that was what was driving it, was to have it ready to go to press in October.
See folks here. I know one of the things you mentioned, I'm just curious to pick your brain, is you mentioned that you weren't Eileen's first choice for co-author for her biography, that there were others. I'm just kind of curious, were the others women?
No, they were not, which was also a surprise to me as well. There were some other well-known space authors that she talked to as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Okay, we do have a question. This is from, I believe, Dina. You mentioned that different astronauts have posted different types of memoirs. I've seen conversational books and some with a sort of business or succeed in your field kind of approach. also those with environmental messages. How did you and Eileen shape her approach, and how much influence did you have? Did other memoirs inspire you?
Okay, that's a great question. You know, I've read a lot of, I think I've read most of the astronaut memoirs that are out there, and there are some that are just absolutely phenomenal. You know, of course, you think about Mike Collins, his, you know, Carrying the Fire. I also think about Mike Mullane's book, you know, Riding Rockets is just another one that's fantastic. Some of them are around outrageous stories. That's, of course, that's not who Eileen is. Eileen's not about outrageous stories. She wanted to, I think, wanted to parallel her approach in this is very much like a lot of the talks that she gives when she speaks at commencement exercises or at corporate events and things like that. Again, it's one of the lessons that you've learned from going through this type of cultural change, and so, you know, for her, I think it really was more about the lessons about how you lead a good life and how you share also, you know, what we've learned about space. Eileen is really big into advocacy for space exploration. You know, one of the things she talks about is getting out of the astronaut corps to make room for more people to have the opportunity to experience space flight herself. And so I think that's kind of the approach that she came on with this. We didn't, you know, the approach to the book kind of evolved organically. It ended up being chronological because we were trying to tell a history in addition to the lessons learned. Not all memoirs are necessarily chronological, but that's just kind of the way that the book evolved. So yeah, we didn't come into this with, again, I think there were some things that she wanted to again share, which was inspiration to a younger generation, that basically you can do things if you put your mind to it and work really, really hard, and to use herself as an example for that.
Got one question here from Laura Bloom. She asked to comment on acquiring the cover photo. Maybe the backstory on that photo. Was that one that was particularly posed or came later for the publisher? Or
okay, yeah, this is
the decision behind, you know, choosing that.
Okay, that was a picture from Annie Leibovitz, a very famous photographer. It was done as part of the NASA art program. Actually, it was commissioned by NASA. They had a number of pictures of her taken, and that kind of became an iconic photo of her, although Eileen will tell you that's not one of her favorite pictures. She thinks she looks too serious in it. But it was one that the publisher thought communicated really, really well. And the Smithsonian, I think, has the rights to the picture. And so the publisher was the one that was able to get that from the publisher. So again, that's one of those things for those of you who've never written a book before. The publisher, you know, you may suggest some artwork, but the publisher is probably going to come back to you with some suggestions for different types of artwork. And so this was the one that they really wanted to focus on.
I was wondering, during the process of researching the book, if you and Eileen both encounter or found that there was I mean, one of the questions I think a publisher said that the book would have been better 15 years earlier or whatever. And but it kind of put in my mind this, having read other astronaut biographies and memoirs, if they're focusing on the astronaut, do you think there's a time buffer between when the astronaut leaves the program and when he basically feels comfortable about talking about it? Because it is a very competitive field. It's basically you can easily be replaced. You know, it's all about acquiring that next flight, that culture, and perhaps more so being female, that pressure being on there. So did you encounter that, or Eileen encounter that at all, about, you know, giving enough time to kind of step away from my role as an astronaut before I start to do a tell-all book, so to speak?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting. It was not so much her concern about the telling about the astronaut corps as it was about her family. She said, number one, she could not have written the book while her parents were still alive. She just would have felt it was too hard for her to be able to do that. And she wanted to give some time for things to happen. And then she basically kind of got overtaken by events too. I mean, her family became her mission after NASA after being an astronaut was her mission. She's very much about what's the mission, and raising her family became the next mission, important part of her life. and of course, then taking what she learned as a leader in those organizations and now starting to apply that in the not-for-profit world and in corporate boards and things like that. And so, yeah, as what happens is you get busy, and time just ended up passing, and you keep saying, I'll get around to it. But for those of you who've never written a book, I mean, you really are putting, it's hard to believe now we're coming up on 2 years since we started this project, but it's been pretty much my full-time job for the last 2 years. So there's a big commitment associated with doing that.
Sure.
Yeah.
In those folks that were interviewed, both yourself and by Eileen, did you find anyone or resistance or folks that didn't want to open up or talk at all, or were most people pretty receptive to talking with you?
Oh, absolutely. No, it was, people were extremely eager to be able to share their stories and the experiences. And so it was a question, again, Eileen is very, does not like to impose upon other people. So it was more that she didn't want to bother people by asking them to be interviewed, as opposed to, once people were offered that opportunity, they said, of course, I'm happy to do that and to talk about the experience. Everyone that I talked to somebody, at least one person from every one of her missions, and they all said she was the best commander or the best pilot she ever worked with, best team player and things like that. So I got a very, very consistent view of her. It was interesting. Even she had me talk to her daughter. Her daughter insisted on my interviewing her, even though Eileen didn't necessarily think that was going to be important. But her daughter said, "I really want to talk to you." And so I got a chance to talk to her, and I was asking her, I said, "I'm very curious about, is the Eileen behind the veil, how it is, what's the Eileen behind the veil look like, as her daughter?" And she said, what she looks like behind the veil is exactly what she looks like in front of the veil. She said, "I've never heard my mom lose her temper except when she got mad at me when I did something stupid as a teenager." Mm-hmm. And so she's very, very consistent in how she approaches everything in life.
Got time for, okay, maybe one more question. Anyone else? One of the questions that came from one of our chat people is there a subtle reference to the possibility of a film? Is that something that you could perhaps comment on because of the content of the book?
We have been approached about making a documentary, which I think would be just an absolutely wonderful thing. So yeah, we're in the process of having conversations about that right now. And there's also a movie being made about bringing Columbia home, which is a feature film.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
oh,
but
excellent.
I don't believe that Eileen's story is going to be part of that, but it is good to know that I mean, certainly it's going to build off of that for sure.
Okay, great. Well, if we don't have any more questions, we're approaching the 12:30 mark here. We're going to have a break of a half an hour in the programming, if you noticed in our schedule for Roger that. So we encourage folks to stretch, take a break for lunch or whatever, and then join us back at 1 o'clock again, where we'll resume our Zoom sessions for this afternoon on the hour for the next group of presenters. So I want to thank you on behalf of Roger that, Jonathan, for giving us a presentation this morning. We really enjoyed it. So applause. And we hope that perhaps you'll tune in tonight on her talk.
Absolutely.
I know you've got some other engagements or whatever, but Eileen will be with us this evening live and virtually. So,
well, it's been a real honor talking with you today, and thanks and congratulations on a wonderful event.
Okay, well, thank you for joining us again.
Thanks.